Geography 507, Geography of the Global Economy, Module 11. We're going to start to look at agriculture at the periphery. We're going to focus on a discussion of its relative importance. Certainly there's a difference between the core and the periphery. And then pick up again on a theme we started before on how investment is affecting agriculture. Now, many of the economic development models are based on what's happened in Europe and North America, and so we get a core perspective. Core perspectives on what development means, on what economic transformation means, really reduces the importance of agriculture. Now, what we've seen in the core is agriculture's share of the gross national product declines. Its share of the national labor force declines. And technology allows for outputs to increase despite the decline in labor and economic importance. Now, part of this also ties into where we get our food, but that typically doesn't get brought into these purely economic discussions. For the most part, development is seen as industrialization. So to industrialize means to economically develop. Most industrialization takes place in cities. So it's thought that industrialization will lead to urbanization. And similarly, a growth in city population reflects a growth in industry, and therefore down the path toward development. This perspective has been dominant a long time amongst economists and politicians, and it's common to most core country models of development. And it reflects a number of points. The argument's made that compared to manufactured goods, food has a low income elasticity. And by that we mean if your income was to double, you'd buy a bigger house, you'd buy a bigger or fancier or more cars, but you're not going to go and eat twice as much food. So the impact of greater income doesn't have the same expansion of spending. Also, agriculture is seen to have limited multiplier effects. We grow the crop, we harvest the crop, we package the crop. That's pretty much it. There isn't a lot of other value added or things done with that specific type of raw material. It has a lower trade value, partly reflected on this having less value added. And the global tendency is for the terms of trade to go against countries that export primary products. So we have a trade imbalance. If you're exporting primary products while having to import secondary products, it means you're exporting cheap and you're importing expensive, and that gives you financially that trade imbalance. That said, it's almost certain the world's population will continue to rise past the 7+ billion we have today. Your text suggests we'll hit 9 billion by 2050. It's equally certain that most of this growth is going to take place in less developed countries. And we can see this is especially the case through parts of Africa. Consequently, less developed countries in particular are going to need to increase their food production because we've got more mouths, we've got additional people. So simply to maintain the standard of living, it's essential that agriculture play a bigger role. Now, another trend we're seeing in our less developed countries is the percent of population living in cities continues to grow. If we look at the world pattern, over half the world lives in cities today. By 2050, they're suggesting close to 3/4. This is rapidly increasing throughout countries in Asia and Africa. But the issue here is it's not because of an increase of industrialization. Many of these places are simply seeing agriculture and the rural setting fail poor people. So when they have nothing, they urbanize, they move to the city in a chance, in a hope to find something. So we have trends going on that are really going to reinforce the importance of agriculture in our less developed countries. Here's a map of agricultural suitability. What's the dominant color? White? No, blue. The bulk of our planet is water. In fact, less than 30% of our planet is land. Now, less than half of that is suitable for agricultural production. So we're down to less than 15% of the planet where we could grow a surplus of crops. Other places are too wet, too dry, too hot, too cold, too mountainous. Now, land is not going to change in terms of suitability just because we have more people. So the areas you see here are places that have been settled historically, and they continue to be the places where population congregates because it's hard to live in deserts or on mountains or in the frozen north. When we compare this to a population density map, they're almost identical. So, what have we got? We have a need for greater agriculture in less developed countries. We have less developed countries growing much more quickly than more developed ones. We have less developed countries putting more people on the same piece of land that is already being used. And we have less opportunity to help. The agriculture that is taking place, we find to have an export orientation, cash crop related, often stimulants, and not serving local diet needs. We have an instability of world prices, so those countries that do pursue more agriculture are pursuing the production of cheap goods, which is a problem if you're going to be involved in global trade. These poor countries do not have the ability to protect agricultural industries or provide subsidies like we see in the core. It's common in the United States for some farmers be paid to not grow crops in order to allow some element of control over market prices. That type of production does not exist in our poorer countries. Yet agriculture is absolutely vital. Absolutely vital because of the poverty component. Now, any hope of improving standard of living in general depends on increasing agricultural production in less developed countries. There is a trend underway in some less developed countries to produce the application of techniques. Now, we've seen this in the core countries post-World War II, but typically it has involved money, and that's been a limiting factor. But we're seeing more pursue something that's called the Green Revolution. What's the Green Revolution? Increase in food production brought about by the use of new seeds, fertilizers, mechanized equipment, irrigation, pesticides, herbicides, you could add in fungicides. In the core, we've been able to boost food production through the use of technology. But technology costs money. Almost everything we see here requires cash flow. The one exception, the one thing that can be done cheaply, very, very basic, but still cheaply, is irrigation. I mention that because we're going to see irrigation play a major role in some of our case studies as a start point. As a start point to try to deal with boosting food production. Now, a major element that's come into play here that's impacted it and has contributed to the urbanization of people in less developed countries is the capitalization of agriculture. We know over the past 25 years, there's been a big increase in direct and indirect investment by multinational corporations in peripheral countries. And we talked about that in our discussion of agriculture and GMOs earlier. Declines in the relative profitability of other sorts of investment has encouraged multinationals to move into corporate farming. They're able to find cheap land, cheap labor, good physical conditions. In fact, sometimes a big advantage of them being in the southern hemisphere because they have an opposite growing season. We've got investment. So we've seen them change. We've seen them pursue land and labor at the global level. Again, pursuing reverse seasons helps with the export focus. You'll see an example of grape production done during our winter, but we all know our grocery stores are filled with a variety of products even when it is our winter, and that's because they're being grown someplace else where it's not winter. The other thing we're seeing with investment and with multinationals is an improvement in their infrastructure and their involvement in this cash crop production, extending it to the production of inputs, seeds, pesticides, fertilizers that will be used in farming, and then also dealing with the outputs in terms of packaging food and also retailing it. So just as multinationals specialize in manufacturing through global sourcing, agriculture has followed the same path, looking for low labor costs, looking for year-round supplies of seasonal crops, and in some cases avoiding labor and environmental regulations. Since the 70s, the global food industry has been one of the fastest growing industries. So global sourcing of food is an extension into the periphery of a shift towards industrialized agriculture. Same thing that happened in Western Europe and the United States back in the 50s and 60s is now being taken around the world. One problem, and it ties to the increase in demand for high value products we have here, like beef and chicken, meats for example, is it's taking over the land from the basics that make up local diets. We are seeing more production of high-scale elements for export, cash crops only. And again, this is getting tied into improved economies of scale as corporations pursue vertical integration. Now, capitalization of agriculture is especially noteworthy in Middle and South America. So from Mexico down all the way to Argentina. Now, as we mentioned before, multinational corporations and international development agencies like the World Bank or USAID, they're encouraging the traditional rural elites who may have control of a plantation worked by a lot of peasants, they're encouraging them to become commercial elites through mechanization, mass production, cash crop production for export. So whether it's done through a corporate farm or whether it's done indirectly through rural elite, mechanization and cash crop production all results in vast quantities of the product desired by multinational corporations. Now, by channeling money into this class of rural capitalists, we're finding a way to consolidate multinational corporate control over agricultural systems, either directly through their own presence or indirectly through their own domination. This has led to a change in crop focus. Over time, it's also led to a change in destination. Before World War II, many of our Middle and South American products were going to Europe. With greater U.S. investment post-World War II, and especially in the 70s onward, we're seeing a lot of these products heading to the U.S. And there's been a big expansion of farming. But the farming has been quite selective in terms of crops. It tends to be stimulants, meats, or other forms of cash crops, again, that don't make up part of a local diet. We see a great application of GMO crops. Give you an example. Here's examples of 3 crops. Sorghum, which is used as a sweetener in all kinds of products through industrial processes. Soybean, which is used anywhere from food products to the creation of foam and concrete. Palm oil, a whole variety of products from healthcare, skin care, to also food. If you compare these export crops in terms of production in the 60s compared to the volumes we're seeing now, you can see where they're dominating food production. That means they're dominating land as well. So we've seen a shift from things that may have been local, produced by local farmers, to ones that are definitely corporate and cash crop based. So this has affected rural populations. Shortfalls in basic food staple production means the basic food items are not being grown and therefore must be imported. Anytime you're buying, you're paying a higher price. Different governments are taking different approaches, and that adds to the complexity of finding one simple solution. Government involvement varies. So we're going to look at the impacts of different government approaches, and I want you to pay attention to the impacts on local people and local economy. We're going to do this through 5 video case studies. We're going to begin in Chile, where you're going to see multinational corporate investment in the new cash crop production of grapes in particular, all for export. We'll move to the Ivory Coast in Western Africa, where we see existing plantation production of stimulants, cocoa, being taken over by the government to control it. That sounds good, but the profits are being spent on investment in other sectors. You can see if that's a good strategy as an effort to try to modernize or possibly industrialize. In Laos, government investment, again, is going to be in non-agricultural activities, despite the fact that at least 80% of their population are rural. In India, we're going to see investment in agriculture through basic green revolution techniques. And this starts with irrigation. We're also going to see investment in factories that take agricultural products or agricultural crops. So an effort at vertical integration to help make agriculture more successful. And the last one, we'll look at Vietnam. We're going to see major changes in agricultural economic policy. Remember, Vietnam is a communist country. We're going to see a variety of different green revolution techniques applied at different levels as it gets more involved. We're going to see vertical integration, and we're also going to see the encouragement of investment in other things, diversifying the economy through diagonal integration.